He opened the door on a Tuesday, the same kind of ordinary Tuesday it had always been in our house. The kind nobody remembers until it becomes the one you can't forget. I was sitting in my recliner by the window, the one with the good light, waiting the way I'd been waiting most days for the past year. My name is Walter Briggs. I spent 26 years in the United States Army, most of them as a master sergeant. And if you'd asked me back then what I thought old age would look like, I never would have guessed it would look like this: quiet, small, and entirely at the mercy of my only son. Daniel was my boy. My wife Carol passed when he was 22, and after that it was just the two of us for a long stretch, until he met Renee and married her and moved 2 towns over. I was proud of him. I still am, in the complicated way a father is proud of a son he no longer fully recognizes. When my heart started failing and the doctors told me I'd need a concentrator for my lungs and a strict schedule for my medications, Daniel didn't hesitate. He moved me into the house he and Renee shared, set up a little room off the kitchen, and told everyone at church how good it felt to finally take care of the man who'd raised him. That's the story he told people. The truth started smaller, and it started so quietly that for a long time I told myself I was imagining it. The first crack came on a Sunday morning, 3 months in. I'd asked Daniel, gently, if he could pick up my heart medication before the pharmacy closed. I was down to my last 2 pills. He said, "Sure, no problem, Dad," and then he didn't. Renee had a friend visiting. There was a football game. By the time I mentioned it again on Monday, apologetically, like I was the one who'd made a mistake, he sighed and said I worried too much. That one skip dose wouldn't kill me. He wasn't wrong, technically, but I noticed the sigh. I noticed how easily my problem had become my fault for bringing it up. I didn't say anything else. I'd spent a career learning that the man in charge doesn't always have to raise his voice to make his priorities known, and I understood, watching my son that day, exactly where I stood in his. The second incident came a few weeks later, and it cost me more than a missed pill. I'd been getting a small home health aide twice a week, paid for out of my own VA pension. A kind woman named Priya, who helped me shower and checked my oxygen levels and talked to me like I still had something worth saying. One evening, Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table with a folder of papers and told me he'd found a more efficient arrangement. He'd be handling my pension deposits directly now, through a joint account, to simplify things. He needed me to sign. I looked at those papers for a long moment. I'd signed enough government forms in my life to know what a joint account really meant, and what it meant was that from that day forward, my money was also his money, and he only needed one signature to make decisions that used to require 2. One, I thought, watching him slide the pen toward me. That's one. I didn't say the word ledger out loud, not even in my own head, not exactly, but I felt something start keeping score behind my ribs all the same, quiet as a night watch. I signed anyway. He was my son. Priya's visits stopped a month later. Daniel said we couldn't justify the expense anymore, not on a fixed income. I noticed the account statements never seemed to make it to me after that. The third turn of the screw was the one that still burns to think about, because it happened in front of other people. It was Thanksgiving at Renee's sister's house. 12 of us around a table. I'd been seated at like a guest rather than family. I'd had trouble getting up from my chair. My knees had been getting worse, and I'd needed help to the bathroom. Daniel, embarrassed, loud enough for the table to hear over the football pregame, said, "This is getting to be a lot, Dad. Maybe it's time we talk about a home. A real facility. Somewhere with people trained for this." The table went quiet. Renee's mother looked down at her plate. I sat there in my dress shirt, the one with the small flag pin I still wore out of habit, and I felt 31 years of service get reduced, in one sentence, at one dinner table, to a lot. I did the tally again, silently, the way I'd learned to log a bad patrol report. Just the facts, no editorializing. One missed medication, blamed on me. One signature, taken under the cover of simplification. One public humiliation, delivered with an audience as a witness to my son's growing conviction that I was a burden he'd outgrown. 3 entries. Escalating. I closed the ledger in my mind and folded my napkin and said nothing, because I was still gathering information, the way you do before you move. The line got crossed on a rainy afternoon in early spring, when Daniel and Renee sat across from me with plane tickets already printed. 58 days in Europe, they said, a milestone anniversary trip they'd been saving for, museums and vineyards, and a cruise down the Danube. They'd hired someone to check on me, they said. A cousin of Renee's, twice a week. I asked to see the arrangement in writing. Daniel laughed it off. Dad, come on, we've got it handled. And I understood, in that laugh, that there was no arrangement at all, that I was an inconvenience being managed with reassurances rather than a plan. That same afternoon, after they'd gone upstairs to pack, I did the only thing a soldier does when the position he's holding becomes untenable. I looked for support on my flank. I called Harold Weiss, an old friend from my unit who lived 3 streets over and still checked on me most weeks, and I asked him, plainly, to keep an eye on the house while they were gone. The mail, the lights, anything unusual, and I asked him to write down what he saw, with dates, the way we'd been trained to log an observation post. I didn't tell him I suspected the worst. I told him only that I had a feeling, and that a feeling, logged carefully, was worth more than a feeling left to evaporate. Harold said he would. He was the kind of man who didn't need to be asked twice. 2 days later, Daniel and Renee left for the airport before sunrise. I stood at my window and watched their car pull out of the driveway, and something in me, some old, disciplined part that had survived ambushes and long silences and worse, settled into a kind of readiness I hadn't felt in years. The days that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than anything I carried home from overseas. The cousin who was supposed to check on me twice a week came exactly once, on day 4, stayed 11 minutes, and never returned. By day 9, my oxygen concentrator's backup battery was failing, and no one had told the utility company to keep the account current. The power went out on day 11 and didn't come back. By day 16, the water followed it, shut off over an unpaid bill Daniel had, in his rush to leave, forgotten or ignored. My insulin, without refrigeration, spoiled within the week. I rationed what I had left of everything: medication, patience, hope. The way I'd learned to ration supplies on missions where resupply wasn't coming on schedule, if it was coming at all. I want to say I never doubted I'd survive it. That wouldn't be true. There were nights, sitting in the dark with my chest tight and my hands too weak to work the manual crank on the old radio Harold had once given me, when I thought about all the men I'd outlived over the decades. Good men, better men, some of them, and wondered whether this, of all places, was where my string finally ran out. Not on a battlefield, but in my own son's kitchen, forgotten on purpose. But training doesn't leave you. I rationed water in cups instead of glasses. I kept a log, the way I'd logged everything else, writing with a stub of pencil on the back of old grocery receipts because I didn't trust my memory to hold the details straight. Dates, symptoms, what I'd eaten, what I hadn't. Harold came by the fence line every few days, unable to get past the locked gate Daniel had installed before leaving. But he left water jugs and canned food just inside the gap in the hedge, and he photographed the darkened windows, the padlocked side door, the meter that hadn't turned in weeks. He didn't know the full truth of what was happening inside, but he was building a record, the same way I was, without either of us saying so out loud. By day 40, Harold had grown worried enough to call Adult Protective Services and file a report, attaching his photographs and the dates he'd logged. A caseworker came to the house, found it locked from the outside with no response, and, following procedure, contacted the fire department for a welfare check. They broke the side door on day 43. I remember the light flooding in, and a young firefighter's face going pale at what he found. A decorated veteran, 81 years old, dangerously dehydrated. His medication logs spread across the kitchen table like a man's last testimony. They took me to the VA hospital. I remember very little of the first 2 days there, only that when I came back to myself, a caseworker named Denise sat by my bed with Harold's photographs in a folder and asked me, gently, if I wanted to press the matter further. I told her yes. I told her I wanted every page of it on the record. I spent the remaining 2 weeks of my son's trip recovering in that hospital bed, and I used every one of those days deliberately. With Denise's help, I filed for an emergency review of the joint account arrangement, providing the bank statements that showed withdrawals I'd never authorized alongside a mortgage payment on a house I didn't own. I signed a revised power of attorney, this time naming Harold, a man who'd spent 40 days proving what loyalty actually looked like. I gave a full statement to Adult Protective Services, day by day, matching my pencil log against Harold's photographs almost line for line. By the time I was discharged, the case wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a file, thick and dated and undeniable. I asked to be driven home the day I knew Daniel and Renee were due back from the airport. Denise thought it was a strange request, given everything, but she understood when I explained it to her. This wasn't about revenge. It was about being present for the reckoning, the same way I'd always insisted on being present for anything that concerned my own life. I was dressed and standing in the front hallway when I heard the car in the driveway, and then their key in the newly repaired door. The fire department had left the old lock in pieces, and someone from the county had installed a temporary one in its place. I heard Daniel's voice, cheerful, sunburned from vacation, saying something to Renee about jet lag, and then the door swung open, and he stopped mid-sentence. I don't know exactly what he expected to find. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe, in the back of his mind, he'd stopped thinking about me the moment the plane left the runway. What he found instead was his father standing at attention in the front hallway, dress shirt pressed, flag pin fastened, spine straight despite everything the last 58 days had taken out of it, with Denise standing quietly beside me holding a folder thick enough that its weight seemed to register on Daniel's face before I said a single word. "Dad," he said. How are you even?" "Standing," I said. "Same as I've always stood." I watched something collapse behind his eyes as Denise stepped forward and introduced herself, and as two county sheriff's deputies who'd been waiting discreetly in an unmarked car at the curb came up the walk behind him. I didn't need to say much more. The record spoke for itself. Harold's photographs, my rationing log, the bank statements, the meter readings, the hospital admission notes timed almost to the hour against the utility shutoffs. Adult Protective Services had already opened a full investigation into elder neglect, and the revised power of attorney meant that whatever Daniel thought he still controlled of my finances, he no longer did. Renee stood frozen in the doorway, still holding a duty-free bag from the airport, staring at the folder in Denise's hands like it might disappear if she didn't move. Daniel didn't go to prison. The county attorney explained to me later that these cases rarely end that cheaply for the accused or that neatly for the victim, and that a civil finding of neglect, a permanent record, and a court-ordered severance of financial guardianship was, given my age and my wish to simply be left in peace, the outcome that served me best. It was enough. It was more than enough, in fact, to watch him sign away every claim he'd built on my pension, my house, and my name, in the same kitchen where he'd once slid a joint account form across the table and called it simplification. I moved in with Harold 2 weeks later, into the spare room of the house he'd lived in alone since his own wife passed. It wasn't much, a twin bed, a window facing his garden, a shelf where I put my folded flag and my old service photographs. But it was mine, in the way nothing at Daniel's house had truly ever been mine again after that joint account was signed. Harold and I fell into an easy rhythm. Two old soldiers keeping watch over each other the way we should have been keeping watch over each other for years already. Denise checked in monthly, then quarterly, then just because she liked the coffee Harold made. Daniel wrote to me twice that first year, careful, formal letters full of the kind of apology that costs a man nothing because it comes only after he's lost the thing he was hoping to keep. I read them. I didn't answer. Some doors, once you understand what's on the other side of them, are better left closed. I still sit by a window most afternoons, the way I did on that Tuesday so long ago, watching the street, keeping my own quiet counsel. But now there's no ledger running in my head, no careful accounting of small cruelties absorbed and swallowed. There's just an old man who survived 58 days on rationed water and a lifetime of discipline, who opened his eyes one morning and found himself, at last, standing at attention only for himself. If this story moved you, tell someone you love to check on the people in their life who've gone quiet. Sometimes the strongest among us are the ones who never ask for help until someone finally shows up to offer it. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another door about to open.